Welcome to the Real Driving Man podcast. I am John Henry. Today we're going to do an episode of Bipolar Talk where I'm going to talk about something related to a mental illness. If you want to check out my other episodes of self-therapy and the interviews I've done, those are a little bit more freeform and whatever. But today we're going to focus on the topic of what is having bipolar really like. I usually tend to tilt these episodes more towards people with a mental illness, but this episode is going to be more geared towards the people around people with mental illnesses, friends, family, people who care about someone who has bipolar and maybe wants to learn a little bit more. As always, I am not a doctor. I'm just a guy. This is all anecdotal, but I have had quite a bit of experience with myself and my family dealing with this illness, so I know a couple things, I like to think. Anyway, let's get into it. So what is it really like to have bipolar? I think it's not often done well in movies because it is a very complex disease. And if you don't see all of it, and what I mean by all of it is when people see someone on a manic episode, they tend to remember it because it's pretty crazy and disturbing. And so people tend to remember the most extreme parts of bipolar, which are an important part of it. I'm going to get into it. But it's not all of what having bipolar is like. Bipolar is a chronic illness, so if you have it, you're going to have it your whole life. And it's not just those most extreme moments. It encompasses everything. It's a mood disorder, so it affects you on a lot of different levels. And so first I'm going to try to explain what's it like to have bipolar on a day-to-day basis. Most bipolars on a day-to-day basis aren't manic or depressed, hopefully. And so is it just a disease where when you get manic and depressed it's a problem, or does it have issues on a day-to-day basis? And I would say absolutely, it does have issues on a day-to-day basis. And a big way to explain that is with mood swings. It's a mood disorder. So your mood and the moods you have are altered by this illness. And that can happen in a lot of ways. One of the ways it's kind of simple, but I have this analogy. Everybody has emotions. And everyone kind of has a baseline for their emotions, whether it be anger or sadness. And I would say that for most people who don't have bipolar, everybody has a dial. And that dial is on like a 2 or 3 for most people on a day-to-day basis. So if you get angry, maybe the dial goes up a little bit, or you get sad, the dial goes up a little bit. But it kind of stays on a day-to-day basis at that 2 to 3 range. But people with bipolar, their dial on a day-to-day basis is at like a 7 or an 8. And so if they get angry or they get sad, their baseline is already much higher than most people's. So if you get angry, you get very angry because you're just going from 8 to 10. On a scale of 1 to 10 for this analogy. And I try to use that to explain why if you have a bipolar friend and something happens and it's inconvenient, as life does have inconvenient times, but they may react in this big way and it throws people off. Like, what? Well, man, it's just this event. It's going to be fine. And it's because your emotions are just dialed up naturally. And I use that to explain why, because bipolar at times can feel very out of your control. I have an awful temper. I do a very good job of making sure that there's very few things that will set my dial off and make me angry. But there's a couple things, like one of them is I fucking hate when I get traffic tickets from cameras. I don't mind if I get pulled over by a cop and get a ticket. It's a pain in the butt. But I hate when a camera or some sort of device in a parking lot takes a picture and sends you a ticket. It feels very dystopian. And when I get those letters, it pisses me off. I get out of control angry. I have this big metal rod I use to work out, and I'll throw it into a tree outside, and I just have these explosions of anger, and I'm embarrassed by them, but it feels out of my control because my dial is at 8. And when I find that thing, these dumb tickets, it sends me way over the edge. And so if you're trying to understand someone with bipolar and you see them have these big emotions, and if you do care about them, do try to support them. But remember that their dial is much higher than yours naturally. It is not an excuse for them to not work on controlling their emotions. That's not what I'm saying. This example I just gave of my anger is unacceptable, and it's something I'm working on. I try to be very open. It's part of who I am about my own issues. It's not to excuse them, but it's to try to get people to understand why people with bipolar are acting this way. Because as a normal person, it's easy to have an attitude along the lines of, well, why don't they just control your emotions, dude? Everyone has emotions. Control them, control them, control them. And the interesting thing is that advice is actually right. You should learn to control your emotions. But you need to be sympathetic to these people, because if you had bipolar, it's easy to say, just control your emotions. Yeah, we're trying, but our emotions are huge, and they're naturally just way more intense. And so I hope that this can help get people some sympathy. And that's just relating to the intensity of emotions. And this is not just anger, sadness, envy, happiness. All these emotions are all dialed up. It's not just one or the other. Some people have, people with bipolar are different. So anger is a big trigger point of mine. Some people may get, really, really sad, but it affects all your emotions, which is why it can be so exhausting. And you want to be able to explain to people, like, hey, I know this is not okay, but I have this disease and it makes it a lot harder, and I'm trying. And if you can try to see that I am just trying to get a little bit better every time, and that I fail like everybody else, that would be very awesome, because it feels like I would have some support and wouldn't feel like such an outcast. Because the other thing that can happen on a day-to-day basis, not dealing with the extremes of the illness, is your emotions can cycle quickly. And this can depend on whether you have bipolar 1, 2, cyclominthia, I think is what another form of bipolar is called. I may have that exact word pronunciation wrong. But with bipolar 2s, and I think they sometimes call bipolar 3, or I'm not exactly sure on the DSM classifications. But usually they tend to have cycling episodes where they'll kind of go mania depressed. And I think that behavior can feel like it happens in everyday life too. I think it's why people with bipolar can be all over the place. I think a great example of this is Robin Williams. And you can cycle. Let me stay on Robin Williams. Sorry, bouncing back over the place. Robin Williams was an amazing comic, but he was out there. He would go up and down and up and down, and he'd be hysterical, and he's really channeling those mood cycles. And he's mainly staying in a state of hypomania, which is a low state of mania. But it's a good example to see how those ups and downs can happen. And in a broad sense, they can happen with being manic and then depressed, and then manic and depressed, and manic and depressed. But they can also just happen where, something bad happens, and you can turn it around pretty quickly and be happy about anything else. And when your moods do start to cycle really quickly, it can start to lead to more severe episodes of the illness. But it can be just where your moods go up and down, up and down, up and down. You're happy, you're sad, you're happy, you're sad. And on a day-to-day basis for normal people, this can be exhausting, because one minute you're here, one minute you're there. I think this is a complaint that a lot of men can have about women, just in general, not even related to mental illness. And I think those with mental illness really do get it, because your moods are all over. You have a mood disorder. It's why I think routines are really important, to have a routine to prevent these cycles from getting way out of line. I think it's sometimes important to let your disease run its course within appropriate boundaries. But if they do start to get to where you're getting manic and depressed and making a lot of poor decisions, that's when a routine, if you have a time you take your medications when you wake up, when you go to bed, it can help keep these cycles within normal range. It can also help keep your emotional dial within range as well. And the degree to which your emotions can cycle, as I was saying, it depends on how you treat your bipolar. If you're a person who has bipolar and you never treat it, you're going to have these cycling emotions all the time because you're not developing a routine to be able to function with this mental illness. It is a very debilitating illness at times, and you need to be able to adjust accordingly. And if you have no treatment for your mental illness, you're going to be all over the place, and you're not even going to be in touch with what your baseline is. And it's why when people never learn how to treat their illness, they can end up in wild places, and often they're not very fun. And so it's very important to treat your illness so you can tell on a day-to-day basis, are my moods getting out of control? Are my moods cycling? How can I figure out how to adjust how I'm feeling about this certain situation so I don't have such intense emotional reactions? What are my weak points with my emotional reactions? Where can I find those weak points and start to try to improve upon them? Where are points that are just going to be weak points forever? For example, a huge weak point of mine is I talk way too much, as I have a podcast where I just talk. And when I love to smoke weed. When I smoke weed, I talk too much. When I'm around people I love, I talk too much. And I try to let people know that so that they can interrupt me, tell me to shut up, and I can take that into account. But it's always a part of what makes me who I am. I'm always going to talk too much. And so you got to try to figure out how to deal with the ramifications of having a mental illness in a day-to-day setting that works best for you and takes into account your own personal quirks and things that make you you. Okay, now I guess I've kind of done a little bit of back and forth with this of, more day-to-day care of bipolar, but now I'm going to move into the more intense parts, the mania and the depression, what really make bipolar what it is. Bipolar used to be called manic depression. I've met some people who think they're different things. They're not. They just used to call people with bipolar, I don't know when they stopped, maybe around the 90s, but I'm not sure. They used to call it manic depression. And then they just changed the name to bipolar. It's the same thing. They're not different. And it's what's weird. I have a couple jokes about it, but you do have these two bipolar sides of, a bipolar side of you that goes between very depressed states and very manic states. And in these states, and these states usually happen, they're not the high points of anyone's life. But they're very different. And they can feel out of your control. On a day-to-day basis, the things I talked about earlier, those things can feel out of your control as well. But I think that if you care for yourself to a degree, you can make progress towards controlling those. When you get really manic or really depressed, and I want people who don't have the disease but are around it to know, it can feel very out of your control. It can feel like someone else is in the driver's seat. And let's start with mania, because they're different states and they feel out of control in different ways. Jordan Peterson had a really good, I think it was in his lectures on personality, but he talked about how happy do people want to be. Do you want to be manic? You don't want to be that happy. And I think mania proves there's a limit to happiness. You don't want to go beyond. Because when you start, first of all, mania tends to only last for 2.5 weeks if you have bipolar 1. Bipolar 1s have very extreme manias. This is the big difference between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. Bipolar 2s will have more hypomanic episodes that can last, I think, I'll probably do another episode to get the exact facts on this, so don't take my word, but they can last from 2 weeks to a month, and they tend to be more hypomanic, which is also very intense, a lot of energy, but it's different than bipolar 1, where bipolar 1, you get psychotic when you get very manic. It lasts for 2 weeks. It's why I think that they're both awful, but mania lasts 2 weeks. Depression can last a lot longer, and I'll get to that. But it lasts 2 weeks, and it usually has a build-up. So I've only had one manic episode. And when I say episode, I mean an episode that usually lands you in the mental hospital. There are times when I've been more manic than normal, but I've never been to the hospital, mainly because I've had very good care. But usually bipolar 1 is diagnosed when you just end up in the hospital and they're like, that's bipolar 1. And it's not like you hit a week and, oh, now I'm very manic. It's a buildup. For me, I've done martial arts my whole life, and my original master in martial arts moved away without really me being able to say goodbye. So I went out to Des Moines, Iowa, where he was and is living, to just kind of have a closure on a relationship. And he wanted me to move out there and help him, from what I gathered. And I wanted to go to college and have my own path. And he kind of disowned me, and the trip was not all what I expected, and my mind kind of broke, because I still do. I still love the man, but my emotions could not comprehend how much I cared for him, and in a way I felt this was a big betrayal. And that it started, and I was not sleeping very much for several weeks, just a little bit. I was starting this new job. I was having a ton of energy, and you feel great. It's why bipolar, when you get manic, is so fucking dangerous, because at first it feels good. I never finished up on that point on Jordan Peterson, but that's what he said. He said in a podcast, I think actually with Andrew Huberman, about how manics, when you start to get manic, it feels good because you have a lot of dopamine. You feel like you have energy. You can do anything. And this is where you don't want to be happy all the time, because what makes you psychotic when you're manic is that you're so happy. Every idea in your head, we all have stupid ideas that we are able to filter through. Like, I'm going to go, I know you're in a conversation and you think of a dumb thought, like I should hit that person. And then your brain goes, no, you shouldn't hit that person. Like, we're in a conversation. You're like, oh, I won't do that. When you're manic, you don't have that. Every idea is the best idea you ever had. And so you can't distinguish between reality and what's good ideas and what's bad ideas. And it's why you go crazy. Because if everything is the best thing that ever happened, then you're fucking psychotic. And that's really hard to explain to people who don't deal with a mental illness like bipolar. But it's very scary, because I would have blackouts when I was manic, where I remember at one time I was just on a bike ride throughout the neighborhood, and I was coming back. I was crossing a street. I was walking my bike across this pretty busy street. In the middle of this very busy street, I blacked out, and I had no idea how I got home. I don't know where I went. I lost the bike. We haven't found it to this day. Just like when you're drunk, I don't know what happened. That can be very scary, because it's someone else is in the driver's seat. And it shocked me and scared me to my core sense, because I never want to be that manic, because you're out of control then. You're psychotic. I mean, when my brother, and one day, I'm a very organized person, and one day I was manic, and I decided to just tear apart my whole room, and it was messy, and I was throwing away everything. And my brother later said, you were a different person. I don't even know why you were doing this. And in my head, it was I was manic, and I knew I needed it to stop. And so I was just trying everything I could to make it stop, and that made it worse. And that's where you'll get into these cycles where when you're manic, you tend to get in feedback loops where I know I'm manic. I'm going to do this behavior because if I can just do this one behavior, it will stop the mania. And usually that one behavior is awful and it makes it worse. And you just keep going on these cycles. And so you get in this downward spiral that can destroy you. And it's really rough. It usually ends with you in the hospital or an encounter with the law, unfortunately. Now, before I go into more broad sense now to depression. Depression's a little similar thing with depression, with how there's a build up to how it gets there. It's usually several steps. For me, my last depressive episode, it lasted 9 months, because that's why depression is what kills people with bipolar. It's why they kill themselves, because depression can last for 9 months or 2 weeks. And it's why this is such an annoying disease to deal with. Because it could last for 2 weeks. You could be depressed for just a couple weeks and then go away. But it could also last for 9 months, a year. And it's why it's really hard when I was at school even to try to get accommodations when I was depressed. Because they'd be like, well, how long are you going to be depressed? I was like, I don't fucking know. If I knew, I'd tell you. And even my psychiatrist was kind of frustrated with them. Like, there's not really a timeline on how long you can be depressed. And this isn't... Bipolar depression is not, I'm sad, I'm depressed, like every fucking Gen Z person is depressed these days. Everyone deals with degrees of depression, but bipolar depression is the worst. It's usually a lot more severe and it lasts a lot longer. And it's actually a disease that you can, it's severe. It's categorized as a severe mental illness because of it. It is so debilitating. You wake up every morning and people have had this before. I just couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't get out of bed. I used to have to like punch my whole body or like try to stab it with a pencil so I would feel pain so I could get out of bed. And it just sucks. It's like this never-ending pit that you just have to keep climbing out of, and there's never an exit. And you just have to keep going, and it sucks. I did an episode on depression. I'll probably do a lot more. It is so brutal. And this is actually a side of bipolar I think a lot more people will have a little bit easier time resonating with, because depression is more prevalent amongst the normal population. But just like I said, the dial, if you think your dial of depression is at 3, people with bipolars is at like a 10. It is very, very severe, and it's very hard, and the only way out of it is through the shit. To do the things, keep your routine that you've done all the time, even though your body makes you just want to die. It's why it's so hard, because there's no easy way out. There's no drug you can take that's going to make it easier, because usually drugs that traditionally treat depression make bipolars manic. It's why it's a very tough illness to treat. And getting out of depression, I remember when I was depressed for 9 months, the way I got out of it was a lot of running. I wake up every morning at 6, and I didn't want to get out. But I put on some David Goggins, and I fucking got out there, and I ran. And it sucked, and I hated every moment of it. But I did it, and it made my depression slightly less awful. And at multiple times during this 9 months, my mom had to drive up to my apartment to make sure I wasn't going to kill myself because it was so bad. And I'm not trying to shock people with these facts, but I'm trying to get people to understand how severe this illness can be. And just like with with mania, depression has feedback loops. You feel like shit because you're not doing shit, which makes you feel like shit more, which makes you not do shit. And then you feel like shit, and it's this never-ending cycle that can be so hard to break out of. It's so hard. But you have to do it. And these extreme parts of the illness, I'm not trying to alienate people, make people feel uncomfortable, because when most people hear this type of stuff, they just want to, shrivel up and be like, I don't want to do any of this. This is annoying. And yeah, having a mental illness is very annoying. It's not easy. And it takes a lot of effort. But if you can get through these manias and depressions, I did an episode last week where I talked about being a mean fucker, because I fucking hate to lose. And that attitude is what kept me alive during these, because I just didn't want to fucking lose. I wanted to prove to this fucking disease, to everyone else, that it wasn't going to fucking beat me. And just having that will to get through it, that tiny little spark that started off as nothing and I cultivated it, eventually led me out of these dark places. And you got to have that mentality. And you need to be able to communicate with people what you're going through. And you need to have support. This stuff is uncomfortable for most people, and if they don't have to deal with it, they don't. But we have a lot of problems with this type of stuff. I mean, we have all these homeless, and it needs to become more normalized dealing with this shit. We need to have people who can go and have support networks, not only with their doctors and people who are caring for them, but also for those around them. Because if you don't deal with this stuff, you're not going to understand it. And while we love to spout out how supportive of mental illness we are, I don't see it, especially with severe mental illness like bipolar and schizophrenia, which is a whole nother animal. These are hard things, but we do know how to deal with them. And the people who get through them are much stronger on the other side. Some of the most amazing people throughout history have bipolar. Because you learn how to deal with your shit, and you feel things deeply, and you can find ways to form a resilience mindset that allows you to say, even though this mania and depression is a bitch, I am going to get through it. I'm going to find a way through it. For no other reason than to just say that I did. Because this stuff it's very easy to kill yourself when you're fucking depressed. It's so easy. Because it just feels like it's never ending, and you know that this stuff is eventually going to come back at some point in your life. And it's why I think having a resilience mindset is more important than trying to find the one thing that's going to get you out of there. It's pretty hard to treat bipolar. There's medications that work, but there's not one silver pill. I don't think there will ever be. Maybe some people say there'll be new technologies, we'll be able to get rid of it. I think people should learn how to cope with it and to deal with it, because it'll make you a stronger person in every aspect of your life. And finally, I want to close with what I want people to know from someone who has bipolar. We people with bipolar can act crazy at times and have a lot of uncomfortable moments that can alienate those close to us. But I want to tell everybody that I want the same things that everybody else wants. Friends, family, a group, a community to call home, good food, fun experiences. I want all those things. We're not different people. We have a lot more energy, and we may come off as a little more intense. But those fundamental human desires are the same. Our emotions and our reactions to things can just be a little beyond the norm in many situations, but we're not this different thing. And I believe that everybody is crazy in some sort of way. I wish I wasn't this way. Most people with bipolar wish they didn't have it, but we didn't have a choice. It was put upon us by genetics a lot of the time. I do think people can kind of create a bipolar disorder, but I'm not too sure. Mainly it's genetic. And I wish I was normal like everybody else, but I'm not. And even if I could take my mental illness away, it's so part of who I am, I'm not sure that I would. Because I don't know who that person is. And as much of a bitch as it's been, it's really helped me forge into a stronger, more resilient person. And we're all crazy in our own way. I think just people with bipolar could have a little bit more trouble trying to hide it from the rest of the world. Because it can just bubble to the surface much easier. But while the craziness may be more intense and on the surface, and you may not be able to understand it, I believe we all have our demons, and we're all crazy. Some of us are just much better at hiding it. And so before you're someone to judge someone with bipolar when you see them on a manic episode, it's not that you have to excuse behavior that is highly inappropriate, as episodes of bipolar often are, but try to understand that there is a disease there that makes things a lot harder than it is for you. And while they may appear more crazy on the surface, everybody's crazy, and you have your own crazy thoughts. We all do. They just can't hide it as well as you can. And it's probably a little bit more intense. I really don't like when people judge people with bipolar, and it happens all the time because it's an easy thing to do. But if you had, just try to put yourself in our shoes. Try to think about what kind of disease would make you do the things that you do when you have bipolar. If you see someone with bipolar do a crazy thing, a crazy act, try to imagine what type of disease makes a person do that and how hard that truly must be to cope with every day. Doesn't excuse that behavior. You still need to find a way to get under control, whether you have bipolar or not. But try to be sympathetic for people who were born with a decently rare condition that is a bitch and a half to deal with. And while many bipolars don't ever try to figure out how to handle their illness, there's a lot of people who do, and there's just bumps along the way. So we ask that you stay by us through the bumps. Thank you.